I'm sitting in my small studio apartment at the Burlington Senior Community Center, staring at a photo of my 3 children from 5 years ago. We're all smiling, gathered around our family dining table for Thanksgiving. That house is gone now. That family is fractured. And it's all because I thought I knew what was best for everyone. My name is Rosalind Thompson. I'm 56 years old, and I made the worst decision of my life 6 months ago. I kicked my youngest daughter out of our family home while she was away on a business trip. I sold the house from under her feet, convinced I was teaching her a valuable lesson about independence and responsibility. I believed I was being a strong mother, doing the hard thing that would ultimately help her grow up. I was wrong about everything. 6 months later, I lost every penny from that house sale to a scammer. My 2 older children, Michael and Sarah, cut all contact with me. They felt I had betrayed not just Diana, but the entire family by selling what they considered their inheritance without discussion. And Diana, the daughter, I thought I was helping. She was the only one who didn't abandon me completely, though I certainly didn't deserve her mercy. Right now, as I prepare to tell you this story, my heart feels heavy with regret, but also lighter with wisdom I wish I'd had before. I've learned that being a mother isn't about controlling your children's paths or forcing them to fit into your vision of success. It's about loving them unconditionally, supporting their journey, and trusting that the values you've instilled will guide them even when their choices don't match your expectations. This is the story of how I destroyed my family in the name of helping it. How I lost everything material, but finally found something more valuable: the understanding of what it truly means to be a mother. It's a story about pride control, devastating consequences, and ultimately redemption through humility. If you've ever struggled with letting go of your adult children, or if you've felt the urge to force them into decisions you think are best, please stay with me. My painful journey might save you from making the same mistakes I did. Let me take you back to where this all began. I became a widow at 41 when my husband David died in a car accident during a Vermont winter storm. One moment, I was a wife and mother sharing responsibilities, and the next, I was solely responsible for raising Michael, who was 17 at the time, Sarah, who was 14, and little Diana, who had just turned 12. Those early years of single motherhood were brutal. I worked 2 jobs, morning shifts at the local bank and evening bookkeeping for small businesses around Burlington. I barely slept, lived on coffee and determination, and made countless sacrifices to keep our family afloat. Every decision I made was calculated around one goal: ensuring my children would have better lives than the struggle I was living. And for years, it seemed like my sacrifices were paying off. Michael excelled in school, earned a scholarship to the University of Vermont, and became a successful accountant. Sarah followed a similar path, becoming a registered nurse at the local hospital. They both married, bought homes, started families. When friends asked about my children, I beamed with pride, talking about Michael's promotion or Sarah's recognition at the hospital. But then there was Diana. Diana was different from her siblings. Where Michael was methodical and Sarah was nurturing, Diana was creative and independent-minded. She struggled more in traditional school settings, preferring art classes and creative writing to mathematics and science. After high school, she tried college for 2 years, but dropped out, saying it wasn't for her. Instead, she taught herself digital marketing and started freelancing from home. This is where my shame began to grow. While other mothers bragged about their children's college degrees and corporate jobs, I found myself making excuses for Diana. When asked what she was doing, I'd mumble something about her figuring things out or being between opportunities. The truth was, I was embarrassed that my 27-year-old daughter was still living at home, working from her childhood bedroom, with no clear traditional career path. I convinced myself that my embarrassment was really concerned for her future. I told myself she needed a push, that my continued support was actually enabling her to avoid growing up. Looking back now, I realize I was more worried about what others thought of my parenting than I was about Diana's actual well-being. What I failed to understand at the time was that Diana was actually doing quite well for herself. Her freelance marketing business was growing steadily, and she had developed a solid client base of small businesses throughout Vermont and New Hampshire. She contributed $500 a month toward household expenses, helped with groceries, and often took care of home repairs that I couldn't afford to hire out. But I couldn't see past the image in my mind of what success should look like. When I went to church or community events, other mothers would talk about their children's corner offices, company cars, and impressive salaries. Meanwhile, I had to explain that Diana worked from home in pajamas, setting her own schedule, and choosing her own projects. The breaking point came during a particularly painful conversation with my neighbor Margaret, whose daughter was Diana's age. Margaret mentioned how proud she was that her daughter had just bought a 3-bedroom house in South Burlington and was planning a destination wedding. The comparison stung deeply, and I found myself lying, telling Margaret that Diana was considering several corporate opportunities and would probably be moving out soon. That night, I confronted Diana about her plans. I asked her when she intended to get a real job, rent an apartment, start dating seriously. Her response frustrated me even more. She calmly explained that she enjoyed the flexibility of freelance work, that she was saving money by living at home, and that she was dating someone but wasn't ready to rush into anything serious. To me, her contentment seemed like complacency. Her lack of urgency about traditional milestones felt like immaturity. I interpreted her satisfaction with her current situation as a lack of ambition. What I see now, but couldn't see then, was that Diana had found a path that worked for her temperament and goals. She was building something sustainable and meaningful, even if it didn't fit the conventional timeline I had imagined for her life. The tension between us grew over the following months. I found myself making passive-aggressive comments about her schedule, her casual dress, her unconventional career choice. I'd sigh loudly when she took calls during what I considered normal business hours, forgetting that her clients were often available at different times. I started treating her like a burden rather than recognizing her as a contributing adult member of our household. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in March when I received an unexpected phone call from a real estate agent. A developer was interested in purchasing properties in our neighborhood for a new commercial project, and they were offering $50,000 above the current market value for our house. The offer was contingent on a quick sale. They needed an answer within 2 weeks and wanted to close within 30 days. $50,000 above market value. I stared at the number I'd written on the back of an envelope, my hands trembling slightly. This represented more money than I'd ever had at one time in my life. It was financial security I'd never dreamed possible. It was freedom from the mortgage that still had 8 years remaining. It was a nest egg that could change everything. But it was also the home where I'd raised my children after David died. The house where Diana still lived and worked. The place that held 15 years of memories, both beautiful and painful. A normal person would have gathered the family to discuss such a major decision. A reasonable mother would have talked to her adult children about selling what they might consider part of their inheritance. Instead, I saw an opportunity to solve 2 problems at once. In my twisted logic, selling the house would provide me with financial security and force Diana to finally leave the nest. I convinced myself that she had gotten too comfortable living at home, that my continued support was preventing her from reaching her full potential. I told myself that sometimes being a good mother meant making hard decisions that children wouldn't initially appreciate. I spent sleepless nights crafting elaborate justifications. Diana needed to learn independence. She needed to experience the reality of paying market rent, managing her own household, dealing with landlords and utility companies. She needed to understand that life wasn't going to hand her comfortable situations forever. Most importantly, she needed to stop relying on me so she could truly grow into the strong woman I knew she could become. The timing seemed perfect when Diana mentioned she had a business trip to Boston scheduled for the following week. She'd be gone for 4 days meeting with potential clients and attending a marketing conference. It would give me time to accept the offer, handle the paperwork, and prepare for the difficult conversation we'd need to have when she returned. I told myself I was being strategic, avoiding unnecessary drama and emotional manipulation that might cloud the decision. The morning Diana left for Boston, I watched her pack her small suitcase with a mixture of anticipation and guilt that I wasn't ready to acknowledge. She kissed my cheek goodbye and reminded me that she'd left her client contact information on the refrigerator in case of emergencies. She seemed excited about the conference and optimistic about the potential new clients she'd be meeting. As soon as her car pulled out of the driveway, I called the real estate agent and accepted the offer. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of activity that I threw myself into with manic energy, as if staying busy would prevent me from questioning what I was doing. I signed papers, arranged for inspections, and coordinated with the title company. Every official signature felt like another step toward securing both my future and what I believed would be Diana's eventual independence. But the hardest part was dealing with Diana's belongings. I started in her room, carefully packing her clothes books and personal items into boxes I'd purchased from the local moving supply store. As I folded each piece of clothing, wrapped each framed photo, and sorted through years of accumulated possessions, I found myself crafting the speech I'd give her when she returned. I would explain that this was an incredible financial opportunity that couldn't be missed. I would emphasize that she was capable and strong and ready for this challenge. I would frame it as an expression of my confidence in her abilities. I arranged for a storage unit and moved most of her belongings there, keeping only what would fit in 2 suitcases that I planned to have ready for her return. I told myself this was practical, giving her time to find her own place without the pressure of having all her possessions to manage immediately. The house felt eerily empty as I packed my own things. Neighbors asked about the moving truck, and I gave vague answers about downsizing and new opportunities. I didn't mention that one of my children had no idea this was happening. My older children, Michael and Sarah, were another complication I decided to handle later. They both lived their own busy lives, and it had been months since either had visited the family home. I convinced myself that they'd understand the financial benefits once I explained everything properly. After all, they were already established with their own homes and families. The closing happened on Thursday, just 1 day before Diana was scheduled to return from Boston. I sat in the title company office, signing document after document, watching as the largest sum of money I'd ever possessed was transferred into my bank account. The real estate agent kept commenting on how smoothly everything was proceeding, how lucky I was to receive such a generous offer. Lucky. The word echoed in my mind as I signed the final papers and received the keys to hand over to the new owners. I had arranged to stay in a nearby hotel for a few days while I looked for a new apartment. The plan was to find a small 1-bedroom place, something affordable that would allow the house money to last as long as possible. I imagined myself finally free from the financial stress that had plagued me since David's death, able to make choices based on what I wanted rather than what I could barely afford. That evening, I drove past our old house one last time. The new owners had already posted a notice about their development plans on the front door. Our family home, where Diana had grown up, where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, where we'd grieved David's death together, would be demolished within 60 days to make way for a strip mall. I felt a sharp pang of loss that I quickly pushed away. Change was necessary for growth, I reminded myself. Diana would thank me eventually, when she realized how capable and independent she really was. I spent that night in the hotel room, organizing my thoughts and preparing for Diana's return. I rehearsed different versions of the conversation we'd have, trying to anticipate her questions and concerns. I imagined her initial shock giving way to understanding, maybe even gratitude, for the push she needed to start her own life. The storage unit key felt heavy in my pocket. I'd rented it for 6 months, figuring that would give Diana plenty of time to find her own place and decide what belongings she wanted to keep. I'd even researched several apartment complexes in Burlington that seemed suitable for a young professional, circling ads in the local newspaper that I planned to share with her. In my hotel room that night, surrounded by my own hastily packed belongings, I felt proud of my decisive action. I had solved multiple problems with one bold move. I had secured my financial future and given Diana the motivation she needed to build her own independent life. Diana returned from Boston on Friday evening, energetic and excited about the potential clients she'd met. I had arranged to meet her at what used to be our house, planning to break the news gently and then take her to dinner to discuss next steps. I imagined we'd have a calm, mature conversation about this transition in both our lives. I was completely unprepared for the reality of that moment. When Diana pulled into the driveway and saw the development notice on the front door, her face went through a series of expressions I'll never forget. Confusion first, then disbelief, then a kind of shock that seemed to drain all the color from her cheeks. She sat in her car for several minutes, just staring at the notice, before slowly getting out and walking toward where I waited on the front steps. I watched her read the notice twice, her finger tracing the words, as if she couldn't quite comprehend them. When she finally looked up at me, her expression was one I had never seen before. Not the frustration or resistance I was accustomed to when we disagreed, but something much deeper. It was the look of someone whose fundamental understanding of the world had just shifted beneath their feet. The conversation that followed was nothing like the calm discussion I'd imagined. Diana's voice was steady but hollow as she asked me to explain what had happened. There was no accusation in her tone, no immediate anger, just a quiet request for information that somehow felt more devastating than shouting would have been. I launched into my prepared speech about the incredible financial opportunity, about my confidence in her abilities, about how this would ultimately benefit both of us. I talked about independence and growth and seizing unexpected chances. The words tumbled out of me in a rush, as if saying them quickly enough would make them sound more reasonable. But as I spoke, I could see that none of my carefully crafted reasoning was reaching her. She stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides, listening to every word but growing more distant with each sentence. She wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. She was simply devastated. The hurt in her eyes was so deep, so profound, that I found myself stumbling over my words, my justifications sounding increasingly hollow even to my own ears. When I finished my explanation, the silence stretched between us for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then Diana asked in that same quiet voice where her belongings were. I explained about the storage unit, how I'd carefully packed everything, how I'd kept her most essential items in suitcases that were ready in my hotel room. I tried to make it sound thoughtful, organized, considerate. I handed her the storage unit key, and she stared at it like it was something foreign and incomprehensible. She turned it over in her palm, and I could see her trying to process the reality that her entire life had been reduced to boxes in a rented space while she was away. Then she said something that cut straight through all my rationalizations. She told me that she had just spent 4 days in Boston, not just attending conferences, but finalizing the biggest contract of her freelance career, a year-long marketing campaign for a growing tech company that would more than double her annual income. She had been planning to surprise me, with the news and discuss moving into her own apartment within the next few months. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as she continued. She explained that she had been staying at home not out of laziness or dependence, but because she'd been saving money to eventually buy her own house rather than rent. She'd been building toward independence in her own way, on her own timeline. She had a 5-year plan, she told me, with specific financial goals and milestones that she had been quietly working toward without feeling the need to justify her choices to anyone. The weight of what I had done began to settle on me like a physical pressure. I had destroyed not just her living situation, but her carefully laid plans, her sense of security, her trust in the one person who was supposed to support her unconditionally. The silence that followed Diana's revelation stretched between us like a chasm. I stood there on the steps of what was no longer our home, holding on to my justifications, even as they crumbled around me. Part of me wanted to argue, to insist that I couldn't have known about her plans because she hadn't shared them. But a deeper part of me was beginning to understand that she hadn't shared them because I had never created space for her to do so. Diana looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, not even disappointment, but a kind of profound sadness that seemed to age her before my eyes. She asked me why I hadn't talked to her first, why I hadn't trusted her enough to include her in such a massive decision. Her voice remained calm, but I could hear the tremor underneath the effort it was taking her to maintain composure. I found myself getting defensive, my voice rising as I insisted that I was trying to help her, that sometimes parents had to make hard decisions for their children's own good. I told her she should be grateful, that I cared enough to push her toward independence instead of enabling her to stay comfortable forever. That's when something shifted in Diana's demeanor. The sadness was replaced by a steely resolve that reminded me painfully of myself. She told me that what I had done wasn't parenting, it was betrayal. She said that selling the house without discussion wasn't just about her, but about Michael and Sarah too, who had grown up in that home and might have wanted a say in its fate. She was right, and we both knew it. Diana picked up the suitcases I had packed for her and loaded them into her car with mechanical precision. She told me she would find somewhere to stay and figure out next steps on her own. When I offered to help her look for apartments, to use some of the house money to cover her security deposits, she declined with a politeness that felt more devastating than anger would have been. As she prepared to drive away, I felt a desperate need to make her understand my intentions. I called after her that I loved her, that everything I had done was because I wanted her to succeed. She paused with her hand on the car door and looked back at me with eyes that seemed older than her 27 years. She told me that love wasn't about controlling someone's choices or forcing them onto paths they hadn't chosen. Then she got in her car and drove away, leaving me standing alone in front of the house that was no longer ours. For the first month after Diana left, I maintained in my conviction that I had made the right decision, even if the execution had been painful. I moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment and began what I thought would be a comfortable new chapter of my life. The money from the house sale sat in my bank account like a security blanket, more cash than I'd ever had access to at one time. But the isolation was overwhelming. Without Diana's daily presence, without the routine of family life, I found myself desperately lonely. The apartment felt hollow, despite my attempts to make it feel like home. I started spending long hours at coffee shops and community centers, anywhere I could be around other people without having to explain my circumstances. That's when I met Robert Chen, or at least that's the name he gave me. He approached me at a coffee shop where I'd started spending my mornings, a well-dressed man in his 50s who struck up a conversation about the book I was reading. He seemed knowledgeable, sophisticated, and genuinely interested in my story when I mentioned being recently widowed and navigating new financial independence. Unlike most casual acquaintances, he remembered details from our conversations and asked thoughtful follow-up questions when we encountered each other again. Over several weeks, our casual coffee meetings evolved into deeper conversations about investments and financial planning. Robert had a way of making me feel intelligent and capable, asking for my opinions on market trends and nodding thoughtfully at my responses. He never made me feel foolish for my lack of financial experience, instead framing my caution as wisdom and my questions as astute observations. Robert presented himself as a certified financial advisor who specialized in helping people like me, individuals who had come into unexpected money and wanted to make it work for their future security. He showed me his business cards, his professional certifications, even photos of his family at his office. He talked about low-risk investment portfolios, tax advantages I'd never considered, and strategies for making my house money grow, rather than just sit in a savings account, earning minimal interest. What made Robert so convincing was his patience. He never pushed for quick decisions or created artificial urgency. Instead, he spent hours educating me about different investment options, explaining market terminology, and helping me understand concepts that had always seemed intimidatingly complex. He made me feel like I was making informed, intelligent choices rather than being sold something. His approach was never pushy. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions about my goals, my concerns about aging, my desire to leave something meaningful for my children. He spoke my language, the language of a mother who had always worried about having enough, who had always chosen security over risk. He made investing sound not like gambling, but like responsible planning for someone who had finally achieved the financial stability to think beyond mere survival. When he suggested I could potentially double my money within 2 years through a specialized fund he managed, it seemed almost too good to be true. But Robert had credentials references and a professional website that looked exactly like the legitimate financial firms I had researched online. He showed me documentation of other clients' success stories and explained the investment strategy in terms that made sense to my conservative mindset. He also understood my emotional vulnerabilities in ways I didn't recognize at the time. He listened sympathetically when I talked about my guilt over Diana, my worry about my other children's disappointment, my fear of becoming a burden as I aged. He positioned his investment opportunity as a solution to all these concerns, a way to secure my independence and potentially leave my children a meaningful inheritance despite the family conflicts. I started small investing, $20,000 as a test. Within 2 months, the online portal he provided showed impressive returns. The numbers looked exactly as he had projected, sometimes even better. I could log in anytime and see my investment growing with detailed reports that explained the market conditions driving the success. Encouraged by this apparent success and worried about inflation eating away at my remaining savings, I made the decision to invest the majority of my remaining house money. Robert helped me structure the investment in phases, making it feel measured and responsible rather than reckless. Each transfer felt like a step toward the financial security I had always craved. It was the second worst decision of my life. By the end of month 4, Robert stopped returning my calls. The investment website became inaccessible. The office address he had given me turned out to be a virtual mailbox service. The phone number went to a generic voicemail that was never returned. The devastating realization that I had lost nearly everything happened gradually then, all at once. First came the unanswered phone calls and emails to Robert. Then, the discovery that the investment firm's website had vanished overnight. Finally, the terrible confirmation from my bank in the police that I had been the victim of an elaborate financial fraud scheme. $320,000. Gone. I sat in the detective's office listening to her explain how sophisticated these scams had become, how many educated people fell victim to them every year. She used words like affinity fraud and confidence scheme, describing how scammers build trust over time before striking. Her sympathy was genuine, but it couldn't change the reality of my situation. I was 56 years old, with less than $15,000 to my name and monthly expenses that would drain even that small buffer within a few months. But the financial devastation was only the beginning of my problems. When I finally worked up the courage to tell Michael and Sarah what had happened, their reactions were swift and brutal. Michael's initial concern about the scam quickly transformed into anger when he learned about how I had sold the family home. He accused me of stealing his and Sarah's inheritance, of making major decisions that affected the entire family without any consultation. Sarah's response was even more painful. Through tears, she told me that the house represented more than just financial value to her. It was where she had healed after Dad's death, where she had brought her own children to visit their grandmother, where she had assumed she might someday bring her grandchildren. She felt betrayed not just by the sale, but by the secrecy surrounding it. Both of them demanded to know why Diana hadn't been informed, and when I tried to explain my reasoning about teaching her independence, they saw right through my justifications. Michael pointed out that Diana had been contributing to household expenses and helping with maintenance. Sarah reminded me that Diana had been the one checking on me most frequently, calling several times a week and visiting regularly. The conversation ended with both of my older children telling me they needed space to process what I had done. Michael said he couldn't respect a mother who would betray one child and hide major decisions from the others. Sarah said she felt like she didn't know who I really was anymore. Within a week, neither of them was returning my calls. By the 6th month after selling the house, I was living in a weekly rate motel on the outskirts of Burlington. The Riverside Inn wasn't the worst place I could have ended up, but it was a far cry from the comfortable home I had maintained for 15 years. My room smelled perpetually of industrial cleaning products and old cigarette smoke, despite the no-smoking policy. The thin walls meant I could hear every conversation, every argument, every moment of despair from my neighbors, who, like me, had found themselves in circumstances they never could have imagined. I had applied for dozens of jobs, but the reality of being a 56-year-old woman with a 15-year gap in traditional employment was harsh. The few interviews I managed to secure ended with polite rejections and suggestions that I might consider part-time retail positions that would pay a fraction of what I needed to survive. My remaining money was disappearing faster than I had calculated. The motel room cost $350 per week. Groceries, gas, and basic necessities consumed whatever was left. I found myself making the kinds of desperate calculations I hadn't had to make since the early days after David's death, choosing between buying groceries and putting gas in my car, rationing my medications to make them last longer. The loneliness was almost worse than the financial stress. I had no one to call when the anxiety kept me awake at night. No one to share small victories with when I managed to secure a temporary job cleaning offices. No one who cared whether I ate dinner or just went to bed hungry because cooking seemed like too much effort. That's when I finally understood what I had done to Diana. I had forced her into a situation where she had to figure out survival on her own, without warning, without support, without the safety net of family. The difference was that she had been capable and prepared in ways I hadn't recognized, while I was struggling with circumstances I had created through my own poor judgment. After 3 weeks of staring at my phone every evening, I finally found the courage to call her. Diana answered on the 4th ring, her voice cautious but not unkind. I had rehearsed what I would say, But when I heard her voice, all my prepared words evaporated. Instead, I simply told her where I was and asked if we could talk. If you've ever been in a place where you've had to ask for help from someone you've hurt, please share your story in the comments below. Sometimes, knowing we're not alone in our mistakes can help us find the courage to make things right. Diana met me at a small diner near the motel 2 days later. I arrived early, choosing a corner booth where we could have privacy and watch through the window as she parked her car. She looked different, more mature somehow, carrying herself with a confidence I hadn't noticed before. Or perhaps I had never bothered to look closely enough to see it. When she slid into the booth across from me, I was struck by how composed she seemed. There was no anger in her expression, but there was also no warmth. She had built walls that I could feel even across the small table between us. The distance was palpable, a protective barrier that made me realize how much damage I had truly done to our relationship. I started to apologize, the words tumbling out in a rush of guilt and desperation, but she held up her hand gently, stopping me mid-sentence. She told me that she had spent the past 6 months in therapy working through the feelings of betrayal and abandonment that my actions had triggered. The fact that she had needed professional help to process what I had done hit me like a physical blow. She explained that she needed me to understand something before we could move forward. What I had done wasn't just about the house or the money, but about trust and respect. She spoke with a clarity and emotional intelligence that impressed me even as her words cut deep into my consciousness. Diana had found her own apartment within a week of my betrayal, using savings I hadn't known she possessed. The Boston contract had indeed been successful, and she had signed 2 additional clients since then. Her business was thriving in ways that my interference could have actually damaged had she been less resilient and resourceful than she proved to be. But the success came with a cost that I was only beginning to understand. She told me that for months she had questioned her own judgment, wondering if she really was the irresponsible child I had painted her to be. She had worked with her therapist to understand that my actions reflected my own fears and control issues, not any actual deficiency on her part. The revelation that she had doubted herself because of my actions was devastating. I realized that in trying to push her toward what I thought was maturity, I had actually undermined her confidence in her own decision-making abilities. When I tried to explain about the financial scam, about losing all the house money, she listened without interruption. Her face showed compassion for my situation, but her response was measured and clear. When I finished, she said something that surprised me. She told me she was sorry that had happened to me, but that it didn't change or excuse what I had done to her. This distinction between empathy for my current suffering and accountability for my past choices showed a level of emotional maturity that I was still struggling to achieve. Then she explained her boundaries with the same calm precision she brought to her business planning. She was willing to have limited contact with me, but only if I committed to respecting her autonomy going forward. She would help me find resources for housing and employment assistance, but she wouldn't become financially responsible for me. She would meet with me occasionally, but only in public places until trust could be rebuilt. Most importantly, she would not tolerate any criticism of her life choices or attempts to control her decisions. Her conditions were firm, but fair, delivered without malice, but also without the unconditional forgiveness I suppose I had hoped for. As difficult as they were to accept, I recognized them as reasonable responses to someone who had proven themselves capable of major betrayals when trusted with family responsibilities. Diana kept her word about helping me find resources, though she maintained the careful distance she had established. Within a week, she had provided me with contact information for social services job placement programs for older workers, and most importantly, a sliding scale counseling center that specialized in family relationship issues. I resisted the idea of therapy at first. In my generation, seeking mental health treatment carried a stigma that was hard to overcome. I told myself that I didn't need someone to tell me I had made mistakes. I already knew that. I worried about the cost even with the sliding scale when every dollar had become precious. Most of all, I was afraid of what I might discover about myself if I looked too closely at my motivations and patterns. But as the weeks passed in the motel, as my isolation deepened and my financial situation became more desperate, I realized that knowing I had made mistakes wasn't the same as understanding why I had made them. The weight of my guilt was becoming unbearable, and I found myself cycling through the same self-recriminations without finding any path forward. Dr. Patricia Hendricks was a woman close to my own age who had a direct but compassionate approach that cut through my defenses quickly. Her office was warm and comfortable, filled with plants and soft lighting that made it feel safe to be vulnerable. In our first session, she asked me to describe my relationship with my own mother, and I found myself talking about patterns I had never examined before. My mother had been controlling in ways that I had normalized as simply being a strong woman. She had made decisions for me well into my 20s, expressing her opinions about my clothing, my friends, my career choices, and ultimately, my choice to marry David. When I had tried to assert independence, she had responded with hurt feelings and accusations that I was being ungrateful for all her sacrifices. She had framed her interference as love and concern, just as I had done with Diana. The parallel was uncomfortable to acknowledge, but Dr. Hendricks helped me see that I had learned a model of motherhood based on control rather than support. My mother had never trusted me to make good decisions independently, and I had unconsciously passed that same lack of trust on to Diana. The difference was that Diana had the strength to set boundaries that I had never been able to establish with my own mother. As we continued our sessions, we talked about conditional love, how I had unconsciously made my approval and support contingent on my children meeting my expectations rather than loving them for who they were. Michael and Sarah had happened to follow paths that aligned with my values, so they had received my unqualified pride. Diana had chosen a different route, and instead of celebrating her independence and creativity, I had interpreted her choices as failures that reflected poorly on my parenting. Dr. Hendricks introduced me to the concept of enmeshment, how I had become so invested in my children's choices that I had lost sight of where I ended and they began. She helped me understand that my need for them to succeed in specific ways was really about my own unresolved fears and insecurities, not about their actual well-being. The most painful realization was understanding that my embarrassment about Diana's unconventional path had been entirely about my own insecurities, not about her actual well-being or success. I had been more concerned with how her choices made me look as a mother than with whether those choices were making her happy and fulfilled. We spent several sessions working through my grief, not just for the relationships I had damaged, but for the years I had spent focused on the wrong things. I grieved for the Diana I had failed to see clearly, for the authentic connections I had missed while being so focused on control and appearance. Dr. Hendricks also helped me understand that change was possible even at my age, even after such devastating mistakes. She taught me about setting healthy boundaries, about distinguishing between supporting my children and trying to manage their lives, about finding my own identity and purpose beyond my role as their mother. The work was exhausting and often discouraging. There were sessions where I left feeling worse than when I arrived, forced to confront uncomfortable truths about my own behavior and motivations. But slowly, very slowly, I began to understand not just what I had done wrong, but why I had done it and how I might do better going forward. One of the most humbling aspects of therapy was recognizing that at 56 years old, I was learning lessons about independence that Diana had been trying to teach me through her own example. While I had criticized her for living at home and not following traditional milestones, she had actually been modeling a kind of self-sufficiency that I had never achieved. Diana had built her own career from scratch, learning skills independently and creating her own opportunities. She had chosen to live at home not out of dependence, but as a strategic decision that allowed her to save money and build toward larger goals. She had been comfortable with uncertainty and flexible enough to adapt when opportunities arose. Meanwhile, I realized I had spent most of my adult life moving from one form of dependence to another. I had gone from my parents' home to marriage without ever living independently. After David's death, I had focused so intensely on providing for my children that I had never developed a clear sense of my own identity or capabilities outside of being a wife and mother. The motel experience, as miserable as it was, forced me to confront my own limitations in ways that were both terrifying and ultimately liberating. I had to learn to navigate bureaucratic systems for housing assistance and job placement services. I had to swallow my pride and accept help from social services. I had to figure out how to stretch $5 into 3 meals, how to do laundry in a sink, how to maintain hope when every day felt like a struggle for basic survival. These practical challenges were accompanied by deeper emotional work that I had never done before. For the first time in my life, I had to figure out who I was when I wasn't actively mothering someone. I had to learn to make decisions based on my own needs and preferences, rather than what I thought would be best for my children or what would make me look like a successful parent. The job search process was particularly humbling. I had to learn to market myself as an individual with skills and value, not just as someone's mother or widow. I had to update a resume that hadn't been touched in 15 years, learn basic computer skills that Diana had offered to teach me years earlier, and practice interviewing for positions that required me to articulate my own worth. For the first time in my life, I began to understand what Diana had meant when she talked about creating her own path. There was something empowering about solving problems independently, even when the problems were of my own making. I started to see why she had valued the flexibility of freelance work, the ability to make decisions based on her own priorities rather than someone else's expectations. The financial constraints that had once seemed devastating began to teach me lessons about resourcefulness that I had never needed to learn. I discovered free community resources I hadn't known existed, learned to cook simple meals that were both nutritious and economical, and found satisfaction in small accomplishments like successfully navigating the bus system or negotiating a payment plan for my medical bills. Through therapy, I also began to understand the damage I had done to my relationship with Michael and Sarah. My secretive decision-making hadn't just affected Diana. It had broken trust with all my children. They had seen me as someone who could make unilateral decisions about family matters without consultation, someone who might have other secrets they didn't know about. The work of rebuilding wasn't just about apologizing for past mistakes, but about fundamentally changing how I approached relationships with my adult children. I had to learn to see them as separate individuals with their own wisdom and agency, rather than extensions of myself, whose choices reflected on my worth as a mother. This process of learning independence at 56 was often lonely and frustrating, but it was also revelatory. I began to understand that the anxiety I had felt about Diana's unconventional choices had really been anxiety about my own lack of confidence in navigating uncertainty. She had been comfortable with ambiguity and flexible planning in ways that I had never learned to be. After 8 months of therapy and nearly a year of living in circumstances I had never imagined possible. I finally secured steady employment as an administrative assistant at a local nonprofit organization. The pay was modest, but it came with health benefits and the dignity of contributing something meaningful to my community. More importantly, it allowed me to move into a small studio apartment in a senior living complex. Not luxurious, but clean, safe, and mine. The job itself was a learning experience that challenged me in unexpected ways. I had to master computer programs I'd never used, learn phone systems that seemed impossibly complex, and navigate office dynamics that were foreign to someone who had been out of the traditional workforce for so long. My younger colleagues were patient with my technological struggles, and I found myself genuinely enjoying the sense of purpose that came from helping coordinate services for families in crisis. Diana had maintained our monthly meetings throughout this difficult period, though always in public places and always with the boundaries she had established firmly in place. I had learned not to offer unsolicited advice about her business or personal life. I had stopped asking when she planned to get married or buy a house, or follow any other traditional timeline. Instead, I listened when she chose to share, and I focused on simply being present, without agenda. This shift in our dynamic didn't happen overnight. There were several meetings where I caught myself falling back into old patterns, offering suggestions about her client strategies or questioning her decisions about work-life balance. Each time Diana would gently but firmly redirect the conversation, reminding me of the boundaries we had established. These moments were painful but necessary, teaching me to recognize when I was slipping back into controlling behaviors. The breakthrough in our relationship came when she invited me to her apartment for the first time since our confrontation at the old house. I had been nervous about the visit, unsure what to expect, and worried that I might say something wrong that would damage the fragile progress we had made. It was a bright, well-organized space that reflected her personality in ways I was seeing clearly for the first time. Her home office was professional and efficient, with multiple monitors and a setup that spoke to the seriousness of her business. The walls were covered with awards and recognition from clients' evidence of success that I had somehow never asked to see during all those months she had lived at home. The living areas were decorated with her own artwork and furnished with pieces she had chosen carefully and saved for over time. Everything in the space told a story of intentional choices, of someone who had taken time to create an environment that truly reflected her values and preferences. It was so different from the rushed practical decorating I had done in our family home, where function had always trumped personal expression. As she gave me a tour, I found myself genuinely proud of what she had built. Not proud in the way I had been of Michael's and Sarah's more traditional achievements, but proud of her creativity, her resourcefulness, her ability to create a life that reflected her own values and priorities. I realized that I had never really asked her about her goals and dreams in ways that weren't filtered through my own expectations. We began talking more regularly after that visit, though always with respect for the boundaries she maintained. She told me about her clients, her plans to expand her business, her relationship with a man named Jake, who shared her love of hiking and independent filmmaking. I listened without judgment or comparison to anyone else's timeline, asking questions that came from genuine curiosity rather than concern about whether her choices met conventional standards. Michael and Sarah remained distant, though not completely cut off. They would respond to holiday messages and birthday cards, but the easy relationship we had once shared was gone. Diana encouraged me to be patient with them, explaining that their anger was about more than just the house sale. It was about feeling like they couldn't trust my judgment or honesty anymore. The hardest lesson was accepting that some damage might be permanent. My relationship with all three of my children had been fundamentally altered by my actions, and no amount of apology or change behavior could simply erase what had happened. But there was something valuable emerging from the wreckage, too. The relationships that were rebuilding were more honest than what we had before, based on mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. Today, as I sit in my small but comfortable studio apartment, I can see Diana's car pulling into the parking lot for our weekly coffee date. It's been 2 years since that terrible day when I sold our family home out from under her, and 18 months since I lost everything to a financial scam that taught me the hardest lesson of my life. Our relationship is different now, quieter, more honest, built on mutual respect, rather than the complicated dynamics of control and guilt that had defined it before. Diana still maintains boundaries that sometimes sting, but I've learned to see them as signs of her strength, rather than rejection of my love. She doesn't share every detail of her life with me, but when she chooses to include me in her joys and challenges, I feel genuinely honored by her trust. Her business has grown beyond what either of us imagined possible. She now employs 2 part-time assistants and has clients across New England. Last month, she bought a small house with a mortgage she qualified for entirely on her own income. When she showed me the photos, I felt a pride that was completely different from the comparative pride I used to feel about my children's achievements. This was pure celebration of her success without any need for it to reflect on my worth as a mother. Michael and Sarah have slowly begun to rebuild contact with me, though our relationships remain cautious. Family gatherings are smaller and less frequent, but they happen. We're learning to interact as adults who share a history rather than as parent and children locked in old patterns. It's not the family I once had, but it's honest in ways the old family never was. The most profound change has been learning to see motherhood differently. I used to think being a good mother meant shaping my children into successful adults who would make me proud. Now I understand that being a good mother means loving my children unconditionally and supporting them as they shape themselves into whoever they're meant to become. If you're a parent struggling with letting go of control over your adult children's choices, I want you to know that it's never too late to change. Yes, there may be consequences for past mistakes that can't be undone, but the relationship you can build going forward based on respect and genuine love, rather than control and expectation, can be more authentic and fulfilling than anything you've lost. Love your children for who they are, not who you think they should be. Trust their judgment, respect their autonomy, and remember that your worth as a parent isn't measured by their compliance with your vision, but by your ability to let them flourish as themselves. Please subscribe if this story resonated with you, and share your own experiences with learning to love without controlling in the comments below. Sometimes our biggest mistakes become our most important teachers.